So in this module, we want to look at how do we add images to a web page. You might be thinking, well, why did we wait so long to look at adding images? I see images on almost every web page. I don't necessarily see list, or I don't necessarily see the section tag or things like that if I go and do a view source. Well, it's very important to get that base structure right. And if you remember correctly, we talked about HTML is kind of like the structure. You think about how is it going to define how something works. The CSS goes on top of it and says, how does it look? Okay, so think of maybe the structure like your bones, and then the CSS being like your skin, and what color clothes you wear, and what your hair's styled like, and things like that. It's really helpful to have CSS, but if you didn't, you still had something to be functional. Now, an image is kind of a cross between it, because our image is going to go out and reference an image file. What I've found is that when people start working with images, they tend to think, well, I'm only going to put images, or I'm going to focus on the images, and they forget about the bigger structure of the web page and the real content, what they're trying to do. A good image is great and makes a web page easier to use, because a good image helps show or describe a concept. However, a bad image is just as powerful, but with negative effects. And so that's why we've held off on our images. Now, I need to give you a little bit of background information about images on the web. Now, I'm not going to talk about like what type of images we used 10 years ago. No. What I want to focus on is the type of images, because this is very important when you're choosing how do I put information out there. So there's a couple of different types. Let's start with file types. So our file types usually are broken down into three main types. Now there's a fourth type we're going to talk about, and I'll mention that in just a minute, but I want to focus on the three types of images that you see most commonly used. The first is the GIF, and it's technically pronounced GIF. No one pronounces it like that though. So we're going to call it the GIF because that's what everyone calls it. GIF, GIF. And it's short for Graphics Interchange Format. It was very popular way back in the 1980s, believe it or not. Now, you might think, well, why would something that was popular 30 or almost 40 years ago be so important to now? Well, there are so many images out there that are created with a GIF format that it's still used, and you still find them all over the place. The fact that GIF images tend to be small. They say that a picture is worth 1,000 words, but a poorly designed image can be 30 times the size of those 1,000 words. So why would you use an image if it takes so much longer to download? That's where the GIF comes in. It's very efficient, especially for certain types of images. Images that don't have a lot of colors, images that have a lot of repeating colors, especially on the same horizontal line. These work very well for GIFs, and so you'll see them in graphs and charts and cartoons and other things like that. GIF is a lossless format, which means that if you save it, it doesn't degrade. It stays exactly the same. And there's a happy little accident built into GIFs. And due to, ironically, a bug, if you're a programmer, you know what those are. Due to a bug in the file format, you can actually create animated GIFs. And what happened initially by accident is now done on purpose to show simple animations without having to have a video format, which can be kind of large to download. So GIFs were great. They have fallen out of favor for a couple reasons. Early on, there was a patent that was involved that cost extra money for developers when they found out about it. That's one thing. We're going to ignore that. GIFs also fell out of favor because there are some limitations to it. For example, they can only display 256 colors max. Now, that's out of a palette of about 65,000 colors. So there's a wide range of colors, but in any one image, you are limited to 256 colors. So that does have a downside. Now, like I said, the upsides are that it's small, and that downside is kind of because of that upside. So we have to keep that in mind. The other thing that we have to worry about is that because that limited size and color format, we can't get a good high resolution, high quality type of image. And so they're never good for displaying things like a photograph of a person or a place or anything like that. So the most common image format used there was the JPEG. JPEG is an open source file format. Anyone can use it. It is a lossy compression, however. And that means that if I save a JPEG image and then I make one little change and I resave it, and resave it, every time I save it, it degrades in quality just a little bit. Think about it kind of like if I take and make a photocopy of an image. I take this document, I make a photocopy, and I photocopy the photocopy, and I photocopy the photocopy. And after I do this 3, 4, 5 times, it's harder and harder to read. You probably ran into this when filling out forms at your doctor's office or something like that. And you're like, do I need glasses, or is this just, really bad? And it turns out it's really bad. It's not you. It's something you want to be very mindful of, that it is a lossy format. You can choose how much lossiness you want. So do I want to save it as a low quality, which is a really small file? Or do I want to save it as a bigger file, which is still smaller than if I did as a raw image, but is a little bit lossy, but higher quality? It's closer to that source original image. That's something we always have to consider. And if you're using a tool, whether it's Photoshop or GIMP or any other type of visual editor, a lot of times those image editors will give you the option. What level of quality do you want to say? Photoshop is great because it tells you, well, we estimate that the file size will be about this big if you save it at this level quality. So JPEGs are great for photos, especially of the real world. They're not good for things like cartoons and figures and having plain text. If you've ever seen an image that is a cartoon or maybe a block of text and you see a little blockiness where things are really distorted, that's a low quality JPEG being used in the inappropriate format. They should have probably used either a GIF or the next file format, which is your PNG. We often refer to it as PNG. It's easier to say than PNG, and that's short for Portable Network Graphics. The idea was to get around some of the limitations of GIF. It allows you to use millions of colors and millions of colors in one image. It doesn't limit you to 256 colors by default. It's nice because it's a lossless format, unlike JPEG. The thing that's not nice is that file size can get really big really fast. So that is a downside to the PNG. Now, it does have what they refer to as an indexed version, which allows you to limit yourself to 256 colors or less, and that makes the file size smaller. Depending upon how your image is stored, it'll be depending upon whether the GIF or the PNG is smaller. It just depends upon the image. So let's take just a couple of quick looks at how we're going to insert one of these images into a web page. I have here my template. I've saved it already as sample-images. And I'm just going to work on adding a single image. Now to do so, I'm going to use the IMG tag. And if I specify just an IMG tag, I come over here and reload it, you notice there's a little space where that image is supposed to go. It moved down. However, you don't see an image, and that's because it doesn't know what image to display. We need to give it an attribute. So the attribute I'm going to give it is src equals, and then I need to specify, okay, where is my image actually located? Now, if you remember about in previous modules, when I talked about website organization and project management for your website, I mentioned that most people will create a images subfolder underneath the folder that contains their website. If we look over here under my project, you'll notice I have an images folder, and if I click on images, you see a couple of new images. So that tells me where they're located. Now, I'm going to create a simple relative link because I don't have folders and subfolders and things like that. So this keeps it kind of simple. So I'm going to say image source dot slash images. You'll notice that Visual Studio Code, because I said use folder, it's smart enough to go, oh, well, here's the subfolders. Inside of those subfolders, here's these images. You know what? I'm going to pick the learn-to-code.jpg. If I just hit tab, it fills in there for me. Now, you can see here when I reload my screen, here's some text. And the text looks clean. It's a JPEG format. Should we have used JPEG for just some text on a black background? Maybe, maybe not, but it works. Let's not argue about what works, right? So here's something. It does work. It's good. We're happy with that. Is this technically correct? Well, yes, it works. It displays our image because it tells us where the image is. Does it work correctly? Yeah, kind of. It does what it's supposed to. However, what happens if someone who was visually impaired came to this website? And what we mean by visually impaired is that they have some impairment which makes it difficult for the person to look at the website. I'm not talking about like myself, which I just need glasses in order to see. And with glasses, I can see 20/20. We're talking about someone who has a more severe impairment. Not necessarily blind. Okay, sometimes we tend to think of people who are completely without vision, and that's not necessarily the case. We have to ask ourselves, what happens if someone comes in and they have a color blindness? Color blindness affects approximately 10% of all American adults. Okay, tends to be higher in males, but some form of color blindness does affect about 10% of the population. And just like there's different levels of vision, there's different levels of color blindness. Everything from red-green, which is the most common, to complete color blindness, which is pretty uncommon. So I look at this, I go, okay, well, if you have red-green color blindness, you can still see this. It's white text on a black background. That's easy. But if you're like some of the friends that I have and their family members or other family members I have, they are completely without sight. And because of that, we need to provide an alternative way for them to know what's inside that image. Well, luckily, HTML gives us that very thing. If I come back to my code editor, I can simply do the attribute ALT. ALT is an attribute for defining alternative text for if that image is unable to be seen or displayed. This can include maybe the image got deleted. Maybe you referenced it on a different server and that server was unable to be accessed for some reason. Maybe it's because someone has a vision impairment, or maybe they're using a non-graphical text-based browser. Yes, those do exist. So if there's any reason that they cannot display and view that image, the alt attribute provides that alternative for them so that they can see the context of what that image is. I simply say alt equals, and then I can put it in here. Now, typically, our alt text wants to be kept short. And I can say, you know, everyone should learn to code Steve Jobs. Now, that clearly is not the full quote, okay? Everyone would agree with me on that. We're providing the basic context. I don't want to describe the exact scene. I don't want to list, you know, if it's a outdoor scene about all the butterflies that are there and how hot you think it is and the fact that it's, you know, a Tuesday afternoon. None of that matters, okay? We want to get the basic concept of that image. And you might have it simple like, you know, lady on a cell phone. And you might think about, well, does it need to be specifically saying that it's a lady? What happens if is that relevant to the article and specific about that image? And so when we start thinking about what we have to put in, because we want to limit ourselves, and a general guideline is about 100 characters or less, we tend to start thinking about what can I take out? How can I simplify this down? Like, I didn't use the whole quote. I used the important part of the quote that I was trying to get across. So instead of saying a lady on a cell phone, I might say a person on a cell phone. because the gender isn't required to convey the meaning of the image. I don't have to specify things like gender or age or anything of those sorts. I can try to be as neutral as possible. Number one, to keep my alt text short, but number two, to make sure I'm conveying the important part of what's there. And maybe the important part isn't the fact of who's on the phone, but that it's the brand new iPhone 35 that just came out and makes everything previous to it completely obsolete. So you must go and buy this new phone for $1,000, $2,000, $10,000, whatever it is that they're going to cost next year when the iPhone 35 is bound to come out. So what is it that you're trying to convey? Is it about a person talking on the phone? Is it important that it's a specific person or a specific attribute about that person? Is it the phone that's important? That's what you need to put in the alt text. Think about those types of things to be the most effective at conveying that information. And let me show you another image. And I'm going to put two images. Okay, so this is home.jpg. This is another file that's inside of my images folder. And come here, I'm going to reload this. There's something you're going to notice right away about this file. It is a very large image. You can notice that how it requires me to scroll. So because it was so large, it could not fit on the same line as my Steve Jobs quote. So it automatically pushed it to a new line. And you'll notice that the browser window said, hey, we'll handle the scrolling for you. This is insane. Okay. We don't typically want to have images that are that big. Now, that's a real challenge for a web designer, because how do I know what you're going to be viewing the web page on? Are you viewing a phone? Is it a phone with a real high density display like an iPhone or a high level Android phone? Is it a tablet? Is it a laptop? Is it a big screen that you might be displaying in front of a classroom? So trying to figure out the right size image can be a real challenge. So let me show you a couple little tricks that we can do to resize it. Now, we want to be as close as we can to what we're going to use. And we'll look at another option in just a minute about that. But let's focus on how we can use CSS to style our image real quick. Come back to Visual Studio Code and go to my styles.css. And I'm going to create a rule for my image tag. And this is something I do for all of my websites, no matter what. I'm going to start with image, and inside my rule set, I'm going to have max width. And my max width is going to be 100%. Now, what does that mean? Well, when I come over here and reload, notice that now I see the entire image, and I do not have to scroll left and right. The image is forced to fit within the size of the constraints of that containing element. The containing element in this case happens to be the full width of my screen. But I can have something that's only 25% the size of my screen. And if I put my image inside of that, it will fit in there. If you think back to our previous module, we talked about the aside tag. And we said, you know what? I only want its width to be 25% of my overall page. And we said that it's not uncommon to put an image inside the aside tag. Well, if I had a really big image, it could blow out that aside. Or I could use the image and specify max width, and it keeps my image inside whatever that containing element is. The aside, the article, the main, doesn't matter. It knows how to handle it. And so this becomes very helpful. And you can see here it's a nice little family type of image that we're displaying. Okay. If we come back to our web page, you'll notice a family together. I might say that it's on a beach. Maybe that's important. It's important if I'm doing like a tourism travel type of thing, you know, come visit the beaches of, I want to specify that. If I'm not, you know, I'm just talking about families being together and spending time together, then maybe I'm just going to leave it as a family together. Okay. Remember, keep the important elements of that image, ignore everything else. Okay. So what I'm going to put in there is going to be very dependent upon the context of the rest of my site. So let's talk about the context and the rest of the site and how we can adjust a few more things. So I'm going to take out the image that has the family running on the beach. I want to put some more content inside of my web page. So let me come back here to my Lorem Ipsum generator. I have some information here. I'm just going to grab some of it. I'm not going to grab everything. And if I reload, you're going to see that I have my image, and then I have blank space off to the one side where it's not needed, and then my text starts below it. So let's talk about how we can work around this. And there's a couple different things that we can do. I'm going to show you the easy one. So notice that my image is not inside my paragraph tag. My paragraph tag, if I think about it, my paragraph tag is a paragraph of text. It's not image. So my image is going to be either before or after any paragraph tags. Same thing with like heading tags and other things like that. So what I would really like to do is I'd like to move the image to my right and have the text move into that blank space. Well, right now my image is justified to my left, so I'm going to use a class. And for my class name, I'm going to say img-right. Go to my styles.css, and I often put all these different styles for my image together. So I'm going to say .img-right. Now the fact that I have an img tag, that's my image tag, that's still in play. Okay, unless I change the max width with my image-right, that's not changing. This is additional rules that are going to be applied. And I'm going to use the float command that we talked about before, and I'm going to float it to the right. And then what I'm going to do is I'm going to say margin-left 10 pixels. Come back here and reload. And you'll notice that I have my image on my right-hand side. I have the text that's to my left, and there's a margin left. Now you might think, well, what's the big deal about that margin left? Well, I'm going to inspect this. Now, you might be asking, well, what's with that orange bar? Well, if you remember from previous modules, we said that Chrome is going to display different colors depending upon if it's padding or if it's margin, stuff like that. That's the margin. That means that none of the text can be in that area. What that does is if there was any text that was going to go into that area, it gets just moved to the next line. Just like it would if the window size was just a little bit smaller. The thing about that is by not putting the text right up against it, it makes it easier to see where my letters and thus word end. It makes it easier to read. Let me show you an example that's really easy to see where this could be a problem. Let's say that instead of floating it to my right-hand side, I want to move it to my left and have the text to the right. Well, I'm going to come in here and create a new class, img-left. And say float:\left. In my HTML page, instead of image right, I'm going to do image left. And when I reload, notice that my text is right up against that border of that image. And because the border of the image is black and my text is black, it makes it very difficult to see what's that first letter. It's hard to read. And I can sit there and read it and I can figure it out. But what we found out is that people tend to scan web pages. And we're going to talk about web page design and how it's used to scan later on in a future module. But the important thing to note is that if I'm looking and I'm scanning a web page and I see something like this, I can't scan it, therefore I'm not reading it, and therefore I'm going to leave. So that's why that margin is so important. And if I come over here to my styles.css, if I float to the right, I put my margin on the left. If I float to the left, that means I'm going to do a margin right. And you notice I'm just using 10 pixels. It doesn't have to be a lot. If I reload, you can see what a huge difference that 10 pixels is. So just something that small can have a huge impact about how easy it is to read your web page. So please definitely keep that in mind. Now, while I'll have these three styles used all the time, I will sometimes add some other styles, and how much I want to use these other styles is really dependent upon a variety of factors. Let's take a quick look at some of them though. I have an img-rnd, and you might think, well, what's that? Well, that's image round. Image round is going to be, I just want to round those edges a little bit. So I'm going to say border radius. Let's do 15 pixels. Now I need to apply that class to my image. I'm going to change this back to be image right. Then a space, img dash. Notice that Visual Studio Code knows, hey, you started img. Which one are you talking about? Here's a couple of styles for you. This is why I like using Visual Studio Code. It makes my life a lot easier. I can move very quickly through it. So I'm going to apply image round to it. You might think, well, wait a second. I can have multiple classes on a single tag? Yes, you can. And this is a perfect example. So my image right gives me some of the rules I want. Image round gives me some other rules. Notice there's no conflicts there. And if I come here and reload, you notice that my image moves to my right, and you'll notice that it just put a little 15 pixel border cutout essentially. That's the border radius, okay? It's just rounding that edge by 15 pixels. That's it. It's enough to look nice. It's not enough to go, oh my goodness, what did you do? But it's enough that I can do something with. Now, another thing I do is something that's really popular right now, and that's the image that's a circle. And I'm sure you've seen this. You might be wondering, how do they take a square image and make it a circle? Well, you can say img-circle. Border radius, and we're going to say 50%. Okay? Come over here, my sample images, and instead of image round, image circle, and reload. Notice that I did not get a circle, and it's not because I did it wrong. I got an oval because my image was rectangular. If I want it to be a real circle, then I need to use a square image. Okay, so that's the first thing we want to look at. The second thing you want to notice is that the image is still rectangle or square, depending upon the size of the image, because notice that the text doesn't go around it. Okay, we didn't actually cut anything off, but we did cut off some of the image and made it so it wasn't visible. So I'm thinking it's saying Steve Jobs. I know it's actually Steve Jobs. It's because it's cut off. Okay, so you want to be very careful about that. It's really important that you pick the right amount of rounding, whether it's 0 or 50% or something in between. A little bit can be a nice style. Too much can make it inappropriate for your web page. So keep that in mind. Then come back here and I'm going to do image round. Now with HTML5, there's been a couple of big changes to our images. So let's talk about them. One of them is something I alluded to earlier, which is your image file format. And we said that there was 4 types of images, and we talked about 3 of them and didn't mention the 4th. That 4th is SVG, Scalable Vector Graphics. And what that is that uses the idea of mathematics to determine certain shapes. And you can go and tell the computer, draw a line from this point to this point. And what you're really telling is it in percentage of the overall image. And that allows that image to be dynamically grown or shrunk and stay at a very high quality without distorting it. Very important. However, it does not work well with photo type of images. Great for graphs and cartoons and stuff like that. So knowing the format is very important. It unfortunately doesn't have a lot of editors. There are more and more coming out. It does typically require more of a designer type of person to use, where anyone can go in and learn Photoshop or GIMP in an afternoon and start to do things with it. That's not necessarily the case for things like Adobe Illustrator. So do keep that in mind. Okay, so that's one of the things that's new to HTML5. That's important. It's very useful, but it's still kind of at that baby step stage where people are still learning how to adopt it. The second new thing that's been added that I want to talk about, however, is figures. You might think, well, what is a figure? Well, it's using the image tag. And what I can do is I can say figure, and notice that this is an option. So here I have an image inside my figure. As of now, nothing has really changed. What's nice about this is that there's a related tag, which is my figure caption. And this becomes more important, for example, if I'm putting like a book online, I need to say, hey, this is figure 1.1. And I can specify, hey, this is a quote from Steve Jobs, or this photo was taken by, or, you know, when it was taken. I can provide some information. So if you think about like a textbook, or if you go back in the old days of encyclopedias, they had an image and then they had something that was describing it that you couldn't necessarily tell from that photo, but you need to provide some additional context, you know, so specifying the figure. That was very important, and that's something that's new in HTML5. If I do it, you'll notice I have this information over here. Now, the problem is that, hey, my image is off to my far right-hand side. My figure with the figure caption is off to my left-hand side. That's because my float takes things out of the normal flow of my web page. So what I'm going to have to do is I'm going to remove image right from my class. Come over here, reload. Notice I now have my image. And once again, I got my big blank space and I have my figure. Okay. So I'm going to apply a class to the figure and specify image right. Now when I do that, notice the whole figure with the associated image and the figure caption move. That's because the whole figure tag got moved. Now, what's some other things that I might do? Well, let's take a quick look. And go into my styles and say fig caption. Maybe I want that to be centered text. So I'm going to do text align center. That's easy. I might specify margin dash top. I notice it's a little tight. So I'm just going to say, you know what, 5 pixels. I want it associated with it, but I don't want it right touching that image, which makes it hard to read. Okay? Notice, simple little changes have a big effect on the usability and how a web page looks. You don't have to be a designer with a 4-year degree or a master's degree. There's a lot of simple things that you can do in HTML5 and CSS that's going to make it much more usable for your end users. And this is just a perfect example. The figure isn't used a lot because you don't often have to put captions with things. And using an image with a figure and not having a figure capture is not real useful, to be honest. So a lot of times you're just going to use images, but sometimes you need to define something about that image, and then you have that figure tag to work with it. Now there's another new thing that HTML5 has given us, and that's the picture tag. I'm going to show you this real quick. The picture tag can be inside the figure tag if you want, but it has an open and closing tag. You might think, well, why is that? Well, it works a little bit differently. Okay, I can take my image and put it in here. You might go, okay, well, why would I bother to do that? That doesn't make sense, really to me. The power of the picture tag is it allows you to choose what image to display. What that does is it means that if you have a bigger screen, you're going to get a bigger image. It's going to take longer to download. But if you have a smaller screen, we're going to give you the smaller image, which isn't going to take as long to download. That's a huge benefit because you think about it, a lot of times your smaller screens are going to be your cell phones, and cell phones are not as fast as a desktop with a hardwired connection to the internet in your local network. So being able to choose a smaller image, in some cases being a completely different type of image, maybe you show different amounts of information, is very, very beneficial. So here I have my picture tag. It's inside the figure tag, so I can still use that. Notice that I have 2 inner tags. Both are of type source. And the source has two required attributes. The media, which allows us to define, in this case, min-width. So the minimum width that this media is going to be displayed is 650 pixels. If you are larger than 650 pixels, then you get to display the image found in the attribute source set, which in this case is large underscore learn-to-code.jpg. If you are under 650 pixels, but above 465 pixels, you get medium learn-to-code.jpg. That's, of course, in case maybe you're using an older browser that doesn't understand the picture and source tags, or maybe you're under 465 pixels. Of course, you can change what the pixel resolution is and things like that by simply changing it. That media is similar to the media query that you find in CSS. And so we can have max width, min width, we can have a variety of different things to define how do we choose what image to display. And the image might just be a larger version of the image, or it might be something that has something different on it. For example, the largest image might have a picture of Steve Jobs in a quote. But that would be distracting if you try to look at it on a small screen, so maybe they just give you the quote. And so we can make content that's going to change based upon the size of our screen display and make it much more relevant. Now, what happens if the image for the source set doesn't exist? Well, I'm going to reload this, and notice that because it didn't exist, it did not go back to my default. It shows the broken image. So don't expect the default to necessarily save you if you're the wrong size. So don't expect to use a default as kind of catch-all. You still need to have those images. So the picture tag is a great way to display appropriate content based upon the screen resolution of your end user. Remember what I said early on. Images can really help display and convey information to your user, but only if they're done correctly. This is a perfect example of how we can use different images to display appropriate amounts of content to the user effectively compared to just displaying images because we can. And that's something we never want to do. So always think about what information am I trying to convey? What's the basic message? How do I get that across? And from that, you'll be better at using images inside a web page.